The child called him father in front of the entire war council, and the supreme commander of the Kareth Dominion asked, very quietly, why? Taren Sollis was not a man who expected to be remembered. That was not false modesty. It was the product of 12 years in the Interspecies Technical Corps, a division so deliberately invisible that its budget was listed under auxiliary maintenance in the Dominion's official records. Taren repaired things: communication arrays, atmospheric processors, the electrical systems of ships old enough that their original schematics had been lost, and someone had to trace every wire by hand. He was good at it, exceptionally good, in the way that people become exceptionally good at things nobody is watching them do. His commanding officer had described him, once in an evaluation Taren was never supposed to read, as reliable in the manner of infrastructure. He had been 31 years old when he read that. He had taken a long walk and decided it was probably accurate. His assignment to the Kareth diplomatic station on Vel Orn was administrative in nature. The station's secondary power grid was failing incrementally, the kind of slow failure that doesn't announce itself as an emergency until it becomes one. And someone needed to be on site to manage it before that happened. The Corps sent Taren because he was available, because he was qualified, and because nobody at the diplomatic station was going to notice him anyway. Diplomatic stations were full of people who noticed other people. Taren was the kind of man that diplomatic people looked through. He had been on Vel Orn for 19 days when the Dominion fell into crisis. The crisis had a technical name: the Vorath succession conflict. But what it meant in practical terms was that 3 separate military factions had decided simultaneously that Supreme Commander Ashen Dre was either dying, already dead, or politically finished, and each faction had chosen a different moment during the same 72-hour window to make its move. The diplomatic station sealed its outer corridors as a precaution. All non-essential personnel were directed to their quarters. Taren was in Sub-Level 4, replacing a failing junction coupling when the alert came through. He finished the repair, it seemed wrong to leave it half done, and then made his way back through corridors that had gone quiet in the specific way that military installations go quiet when something has gone very wrong. He was passing the station's secondary residential wing when he heard it. A sound, small, wet. The unmistakable sound of a child who has been crying for a long time and has not yet decided to stop. Taren stopped walking. The sound was coming from behind a door marked with the Kareth Command insignia, the double crescent of the Supreme Commander's household. Taren stood in the empty corridor for several seconds. It was, objectively, not his problem. He was a technician. He repaired power grids. Whatever was behind that door was a diplomatic matter, a security matter, a command chain matter. It was several varieties of someone else's problem and none of his. He knocked anyway. No answer. The sound continued. The door was not locked, a detail that would later be cited in the official inquiry as an oversight by the security team who had been pulled to reinforce the outer perimeter. Taren pushed it open. The room was a temporary nursery. Someone had furnished it hastily, a sleeping platform too large for its occupant, a pile of imported comfort items stacked in the corner, the kind of improvised domesticity that results when a military operation has to accommodate a small child and is slightly embarrassed about it. The child was sitting in the middle of the floor. She was, by Taren's best estimate, somewhere between 18 months and 2 years old in human equivalent terms. Kareth children were difficult to age precisely. They had the same large, dark-adapted eyes as adult Kareth, and their features had the same structured stillness, but at this size they were also possessed of a kind of absolute, unguarded emotionality that adult Kareth spent considerable effort learning to suppress. She had been crying. She was still crying in the diminishing way, the way that meant she had been doing it long enough to have mostly exhausted herself. Her eyes, when she looked at him, were gold. Most Kareth had silver eyes. He would later learn that gold was the Dre bloodline marker, the color that appeared once in several generations and was considered either auspicious or dangerous depending on which historian you consulted. He did not know any of that then. He just saw a very small person sitting on the floor in an empty room crying. Taren sat down on the floor. He was not sure why. It seemed like the right thing to do, getting low, getting small, not looming in the doorway of a room that already felt too large for its occupant. The child looked at him. He looked at her. "Hey," he said. She made a sound that was not quite a word. Her small hands opened and closed. He did not know how long she had been alone. He did not know if anyone was coming. He did know, from the silence outside and the sealed corridors and the way the entire station had contracted inward around itself, that wherever the people responsible for this child were, they were not close. He had a younger sister. She had been 2 years old when their father left for his third deployment and did not come back. Taren had been 9. He remembered very specifically the way a small person's grief felt when you were the only one available to sit with it. He reached into his kit bag and found a ration packet, the pressed grain kind, slightly sweet, which was universal enough that Kareth children could eat it safely. He opened it, he offered it. The child stared at it. Then she took it with both hands, with the solemn concentration of someone accepting a very important object. She ate it slowly. She stopped crying. Taren remained on the floor. What followed was approximately 5 hours of the most unexpectedly absorbing time he had spent in 12 years of largely solitary work. The child, he did not know her name yet, was in possession of an extremely strong personality for someone who could not yet form complete sentences in any language he spoke. She had opinions. They were communicated through expression, gesture, and a range of vocalizations that Taren began to interpret with increasing accuracy over the first 2 hours. She did not like the corner of the room with the stacked supplies. She communicated this by refusing to look at it. She did like the ceiling fixture, which pulsed with a slow bioluminescent cycle that the Kareth used for circadian regulation. She communicated this by pointing at it repeatedly until Taren confirmed aloud that yes, it was there, it was nice. He also saw it. He had a small multi-tool in his kit that was, objectively, just a multi-tool. In her hands it became an object of profound importance. She examined every component with focused intensity. She handed it back to him. She waited. He folded a piece of it out. She took it again. This went on for 40 minutes. At some point he began to narrate. He didn't do it consciously. It was just that the silence felt wrong, and talking felt better, and she seemed to listen even though she couldn't understand him. He told her about the junction coupling he'd been replacing. He told her about the secondary power grid and why the particular brand of junction coupling the station had been using was a substandard choice for that load capacity. He told her about a job he'd done 2 years ago on a research station near the outer relay point, where the entire atmospheric system had been wired incorrectly by someone who clearly had never read the manual and had relied instead on enthusiasm and hope. She listened to all of it. She made sounds at appropriate intervals. She seemed, in some fundamental way, satisfied. Around her 3 she climbed into his lap without warning or preamble, the way small children do, as though it was simply the obvious next step, and she was mildly confused about why it had taken this long. She was heavier than she looked. She leaned against his chest. She fell asleep. Taren did not move for the next 40 minutes. He had nowhere to be. The station was in lockdown. The corridor outside was empty. And there was something about holding a sleeping child. The absolute unguarded trust of it, the way they go completely still, completely present, that made moving feel like a kind of betrayal. When she woke up, she was in excellent spirits. She did not seem concerned about where she was or who he was. She had apparently processed all of that during her nap and arrived at satisfactory conclusions. She pointed at his chest insignia. The technical core marker, a small silver hexagon that meant nothing outside of maintenance divisions, and said a word. It wasn't a word he recognized. He said, "I don't know what that means in standard." She said it again, more firmly. "Okay," Taren said. "Sure." She patted the insignia. She looked at him. Something in her expression had settled into a kind of calm certainty that he would encounter many times over the following months and never quite get used to. It was the expression of someone who has completed a calculation and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to process the result. When the security team finally came, 5 hours after Taren had found her, 7 hours after she had apparently been left alone, the child was sitting in his lap again, both of them examining a schematic he'd pulled up on his hand terminal, because she had found his stylus and started drawing on his forearm, and this seemed like a reasonable redirection. The senior security officer, a tall Kareth woman named Veth, who would later become someone Taren knew well enough to recognize her expression of extreme controlled exasperation, stopped in the doorway and stared. The child looked up. She looked at Veth. She looked back at Taren. She pointed at him and said, with complete clarity and apparent pride, a word that Taren did not immediately recognize. He looked at Veth. Veth's expression had shifted from controlled exasperation to something harder to categorize. "What did she say?" Taren asked. Veth was quiet for a moment. She said, "Sen." Taren waited. "And that means protector parent," Veth said. "It is a specific word. Children use it for a pause. For the adult they have designated as their primary guardian." Taren looked at the child. The child looked at him with those gold eyes and the expression of someone who has said the correct thing and is waiting for confirmation. "I was just watching her," Taren said. "I found her alone. I was just watching her. Yes, Veth said in a tone that suggested she understood this and that it was not going to matter. She was right, it did not matter. He filed a report. It was thorough, accurate, and included the clear notation that the child's use of the term had been spontaneous and was not the result of any deliberate action on his part. The report was received, logged, and placed into the queue of approximately 1,400 other reports generated during the 72 hours of the succession crisis. Nobody read it for 6 weeks. By then, the situation had changed. Children, Taren discovered over the following weeks, are extremely consistent about things that matter to them. The child, whose name he learned was Kayla, second daughter of Supreme Commander Ashen Dre, and the one person in the Dre household who had, in the chaos of the crisis, been left without an assigned guardian, had made a decision about Taren. She communicated this decision by requiring, with increasing volume and clarity, his presence at specific intervals throughout the day. This was unusual. He was a technician. He had a power grid to maintain. The power grid continued to have problems, and he continued to fix them. And somewhere in the margins of this work, he also became the person a 2-year-old Kareth child screamed for when she couldn't find him. The diplomatic staff found this baffling. The security team found it professionally inconvenient. The station administrator found it politically complicated, and chose not to think about it. Veth, who had apparently been assigned to monitor the situation with the weary pragmatism of someone who has seen stranger things, found it something she didn't name out loud, but which occasionally showed up in the corners of her expression as something very close to warmth. Kayla was not an easy child in the way that some small children are easy, placid, adaptable, content to be transferred between caregivers without registering the difference. She was, in fact, the opposite. She had strong preferences about everything. She preferred certain textures of food and would remove the others from her plate with focused precision. She preferred the bioluminescent cycle set to its slower pattern. She preferred to hear things explained rather than simply directed, which was unusual for her age, and which Taren, without thinking much about it, accommodated by explaining things. He explained how pressure differentials worked. He explained why certain metals corrode faster than others in atmospheric conditions. He explained the basic logic of how a power grid distributes load with diagrams. Because she pointed at his terminal until he pulled up diagrams. She could not have understood most of it. She seemed to find the explanations themselves valuable regardless. She also taught him things in the way that small children teach adults by forcing them to see ordinary objects with completely fresh attention. She found something extraordinary in the reflective surface of a heat exchange panel. She found something worthy of sustained examination in the pattern of condensation on the outer hull windows. She had a response to music, any music, that was so physical and immediate and unguarded that the first time Taren's personal comm played something while she was in the room, she went completely still, as though receiving a signal, and then began to move in a way that could not be called dancing exactly, but was clearly the intention of dancing. He had not had anything he would describe as a life outside of his work for about 6 years. The work was enough, or he had made it enough, or he had stopped noticing that it wasn't. Kayla did not care about any of that. She arrived in the margins of his days and made them larger. Supreme Commander Ashen Dre returned to the station at week 8. The succession crisis had been resolved. Not cleanly. Nothing like that was ever clean, but resolved enough that the Supreme Commander could leave the capital and return to the diplomatic work that had brought her to Vel Orn in the first place. She was not the person her official briefings described. Taren had read those briefings, the way anyone on a station reads everything available about the person who controls their assignment. The briefings described a tactician, a political architect, someone who had consolidated power not through violence but through the patient, methodical construction of alliances so interlocking that moving against her required simultaneously dismantling half the Dominion's existing structure. The briefings were accurate as far as they went. They did not mention that she was approximately 40 standard years old, that she moved through spaces with the particular economy of someone who has spent decades being watched, and that she had gold eyes, the same gold as Kayla's, the same rare marker, the same quality of seeing things with absolute directness. Taren met her in the station's central garden, a modest space, a compromise between the diplomatic wing's insistence on aesthetic consideration and the technical wing's insistence on structural practicality, that had ended up being quietly pleasant in the way that compromises sometimes accidentally achieved. He was there because Kayla was there, sitting in the low sunlight, engaged in an extremely serious project involving several of his tools, and a pile of decorative gravel that she was sorting by some criteria only she understood. Taren was 4 feet away, eating lunch, because wherever Kayla was he tended to be nearby now, which had stopped feeling strange about 3 weeks ago. Ashendray walked in. She did not announce herself. She stopped when she saw her daughter, and something in her expression shifted in a way that Taren would spend considerable time afterward trying to describe and failing. It was the look of someone who had held themselves at perfect tension for 8 weeks and felt something in them release. Then Kayla saw her mother. She stood up. She pointed at Taren. She said clearly and with great satisfaction, "Sen." Ashendray's expression did not change. She walked to her daughter, crouched to her daughter's level, took her daughter's face very gently in both hands and looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood. She turned to look at Taren. Taren had stood. He was already forming the explanation. He was fairly certain the explanation was adequate. He was also fairly certain, looking at those gold eyes, that adequate was not quite the right standard for this particular moment. "Your daughter was alone during the first hours of the crisis," he said. "I found her. I stayed with her until the security team came. The rest," he paused. "The rest happened incrementally." Ashendray looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Kayla, who had returned to her gravel project with the equanimity of someone who has accomplished the important thing and is now content to wait for the adults to finish catching up. "Incrementally," the Supreme Commander said. "Yes, and my security team allowed this incremental arrangement to continue for 8 weeks. No one told me to stop," Taren said. This was accurate. He had waited every week for someone to tell him to stop. No one had. Ashendray was quiet for a long time. She sat down on the bench beside the small garden path, which was not the action Taren had been expecting. She looked at her daughter. She looked at him. She said, "Explain the incremental." So he did. He told her about the junction coupling and the empty corridor and the sound a child makes when she's been alone too long. He told her about the multi-tool and the ceiling light and the 5 hours on the floor. He told her about Sen, which he still couldn't quite say without feeling the weight of it, and Veth's expression when she'd said it, and the report he'd filed that no one had read. He told her about the gravel sorting, which had apparently been ongoing for 11 days, and which he still did not understand the logic of. He told her about the music, how Kayla went completely still when she heard it, how she moved toward it like something being called home. He told her about the day Kayla had taken her first steps in his direction, down the corridor outside her room, 4 steps and then a 5th, wobbling, and he had caught her when she tipped, and she had looked up at him from his arms with the expression of someone who had done exactly what they intended and was not sure what all the fuss was about. Ashendray listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that Taren started to wonder if he had said something wrong. "She walked to you," Ashendray said finally. "Not a question. Yes, her first steps. Yes, it happened to be where I was." The Supreme Commander made a small sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was something adjacent to a laugh, in the way that things are adjacent to their names when they're still in the process of becoming themselves. "Kayla," she said, "has never in her life walked toward something by accident." Taren didn't have an answer for that. Ashendray looked at her daughter for a long moment. Kayla was holding up a piece of gravel, examining it in the light. She glanced at her mother and then at Taren with the expression of someone conducting a survey. "You will stay," Ashendray said. It was not a question, and it was not an order either, not quite. It was something that occupied the space between those two things, the space reserved for statements that both parties understand are more complicated than they sound. "I have a power grid to maintain," Taren said. "Yes," she said. "You do." And then she said nothing else for a while, and Taren sat back down, and Kayla moved from her gravel pile to climb into his lap. She always did this at some point. It was inevitable, and he had stopped being startled by it. And the 3 of them sat in the garden in the slow afternoon light, while the diplomatic station continued its business around them, and something in that moment became something else. It happened without a formal announcement. No one declared it. No memo was circulated. But the station had its own intelligence, the kind of distributed awareness that develops in any enclosed community, and within 2 weeks of the Supreme Commander's return, everyone knew that something had shifted. Junior diplomats found reasons to leave rooms before Taren entered them. Veth stopped explaining his presence to visiting officials and started simply not mentioning it, which was a different kind of explanation. The station administrator sent a communication to her supervisors that contained in its 8th paragraph, a notation so carefully worded that it said almost nothing while communicating everything. Taren didn't notice most of this because he was not someone who typically noticed things happening around him at the social register. He noticed power draws and pressure variations, and the specific sound a junction coupling made when it was 17% from failure. He noticed that Kayla had developed a strong opinion about her sleeping arrangements, and that the opinion involved him being within audible distance. He noticed that Ashendré had begun requesting his presence at working meals that were not, technically, his responsibility to attend. The first meal was formal. The second was slightly less formal. By the fourth, Kayla had decided that the arrangement of chairs was wrong and had corrected it by pushing one significantly closer to another, and no one had moved them back, and Taren had stopped noticing that they were different. Ashendré was not the person her briefings described. She was not the person her staff described either. That version was precise, controlled, every word chosen. She was those things. She was also someone who drank her tea cold because she got absorbed in work and forgot it. Someone who had read every published paper on Karath child development with the focused intensity of a general studying a campaign map. Someone who laughed when something was actually funny, with a directness that was completely at odds with the careful management of her public expression, and who seemed faintly surprised by her own laughter every time. The first time Taren made her laugh. Really laugh, not the small controlled acknowledgement. She looked at him afterward with an expression he couldn't quite read. The second time, she looked at him and then looked away, which was a different kind of unreadable. The third time, she didn't look away, and neither did he. Months accumulated. Kayla grew taller, her vocabulary developing into something that combined Karath, standard, and at least two words she had apparently invented herself and which both Taren and Ashendré had adopted without noticing. The power grid on Vel Orn was by now probably the most meticulously maintained secondary grid in the Dominion. Taren's commanding officer had sent 3 separate inquiries about his timeline for return to standard rotation. Taren had replied to each one with a detailed technical justification. His commanding officer had stopped sending inquiries. One evening late, after Kayla was asleep, she slept now with the multi-tool on the shelf beside her bed. Taren had given her a decommissioned one, its components safe, its significance apparently enormous. Taren and Ashendré were in the station's small operations room, her working him present in the way he had gradually become present, like a piece of the room that had been rearranged and fit better in the new position. Ashendré was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I was wrong about the crisis." Taren looked up from his terminal. "Not about the tactics. The tactics were sound." She paused. "I was wrong about what I was protecting." He waited. "I thought I was protecting the Dominion, the command structure, the people who depended on its stability." She looked at the schematic on the wall, a map of the station systems, something Taren had put up for practical reasons that had somehow become a fixture of the room. "I was. But I was protecting it from the wrong direction. I was protecting it as a structure, as a system." A pause. "Kayla's eyes are gold because of a bloodline that has maintained the Dominion's central authority for 200 years. Every predecessor I have looked at that color and thought, continuity, legacy, the weight of the whole thing carried forward." She stopped. "And now?" Taren asked. "Now," Ashendré said, "when I look at her, I think about the fact that she was alone in a room for 7 hours, and the person who sat on the floor with her was a man nobody in my command structure had thought to include in any protocol. The room was quiet." "She chose right," Ashendré said. Her voice was frozen right. "It is one of the things I find most," a pause, "most significant about her." Taren set his terminal down. Ashendré looked at him, not the look she used in meetings, not the look she used with her staff. The look she used, he had come to understand only when there was no version of the moment that required management. "She told me yesterday," Ashendré said, "that she had already decided about us." Taren was quiet for a moment. "She's 2.5, yes. She explained this to you, in significant detail given her current vocabulary. And what did she decide?" Ashendré's expression moved. It moved in the specific way he had spent months learning to read. The small shift that meant she was allowing something through that she would normally hold. "That it was already done," she said. "That we were simply slow." Taren looked at her for a long moment. The schematic on the wall pulsed softly with the grid's status indicators, all green, all stable, the system healthy and whole. "She's not wrong," he said. Ashendré looked at him with those gold eyes, the ones that had navigated a succession crisis and 40 years of political architecture, and smiled. A real one. The kind that arrived without management and stayed that way. No, she agreed, she rarely is. He crossed the room. The distance was not significant. Neither was the moment, in the way that moments aren't until they are. Until you understand that all the weight that will accumulate afterward was already present in that instant, quiet and patient, waiting for the two of you to stop being slow. He kissed her. She let him. She kissed him back, with the directness of someone who had made her decision, and was not interested in hedging it. When they pulled apart, she rested her head against his briefly. A Karath gesture he had learned. That meant something. It would take him another 6 months and 2 language consultants to find the right standard translation for a word that lived in the territory between belonging and chosen and home. They did not announce anything. It was not, in the end, the kind of thing that needed announcement. The station already knew. Kayla, obviously, had known for some time. Veth, when Taren encountered her in the corridor 2 days later, looked at him with an expression of absolute unsurprise, and said, "I filed the updated access protocols this morning," which was the most pragmatic acknowledgement of a significant life development Taren had ever received, and which he found somehow exactly right. The formal ceremony was 7 months later. It was small. Ashen Dre had wanted something private, which meant something attended by only the senior diplomatic staff and 200 of the Dominion's most significant political figures, which was, apparently, small by Dominion standards. Taren wore technical corps dress uniform, which prompted exactly one protocol complaint and which Ashen Dre overruled in 4 words. Kayla spent the ceremony in his arms, which she had decided on the morning of the ceremony and which nobody questioned. She was 3 by then. Her vocabulary was now genuinely alarming. She informed 3 separate ambassadors with clarity and evident satisfaction that she had arranged the event. The ambassadors uniformly believed her. There was very little evidence to the contrary. When the vows were spoken, in both Standard and High Karath, the translation Taren had worked on for 2 months, Kayla reached up and patted his face with one small hand. He looked at her. She gave him the expression she had given him that first night. The expression of a completed calculation. The expression of someone who has organized things correctly and is patient enough to let the rest of the universe catch up. In the official record, the Taren Sollis integration into the Dre household is categorized under Diplomatic Personnel Developments. The Human Karath Technical Cooperation Protocols, which expanded significantly over the following decade, are attributed to the Supreme Commander's strategic vision. The cross-species communication frameworks, which Taren helped design, are documented in 7 academic papers that describe their origin as a natural outgrowth of diplomatic proximity. None of the papers mention a junction coupling. None mention a child alone in a room. None mention 5 hours on the floor, or a multi-tool, or the specific sound a child makes when she has decided, with the absolute authority available only to people too young to understand doubt, that someone belongs to her. The historians will have their explanations. They will construct careful lineages of cause and effect, trace the policy developments back to their origins, identify the strategic decisions that shaped 2 decades of relative peace between species that had spent the century before in various states of mutual suspicion. What none of them will fully trace is the original event, the junction coupling in sublevel 4, the corridor, the door left unlocked, the small sound on the other side of it. What none of them will understand is that Kayla Dre, at 18 months old with gold eyes and absolute certainty, looked at a man nobody had thought to put in any protocol, and knew something true. She has never in all the years since been wrong about people. Neither has he anymore. She taught him that, or returned it to him, the way children return things to adults who have been too long alone. The ability to sit on the floor. The ability to explain things to someone who can't yet understand them, simply because the explaining is worth doing. The ability to recognize when something is right without requiring it to be logical first. Some things, it turns out, do not begin at negotiation tables. Some things begin with a sound in an empty corridor, and a man with nowhere important to be, who knocks on a door anyway.